He thought he was just picking up his daughter from school, until a poor boy saved her life, and revealed a truth that changed everything. Matthew Carter wasn't used to witnessing things he couldn't control. He had built his empire with precision, every risk calculated, every decision executed with cold efficiency. As the CEO of one of the country's top investment firms, he was a man whose voice could move markets. Yet nothing in his professional life could have prepared him for what he saw that afternoon outside his daughter's elementary school. The day had been routine, at least on the surface. Meetings, calls, contracts. He left the office earlier than usual, checking his watch as his black SUV pulled up outside the school gates. His driver stepped out, but Matthew motioned for him to stay. He preferred to greet Haley himself, especially now. His 6-year-old daughter had broken her leg 3 weeks earlier during a playground accident. She was brave about it, too brave sometimes. Walking on crutches, refusing help, smiling through pain. She reminded him so much of her mother it hurt. That day, instead of waiting for one of the teachers to escort her across the small street in front of the school, Haley had insisted she could manage on her own. He saw her from across the street, determinedly making her way down the curb, balancing the weight of her backpack, wobbling slightly on her crutches. At first, he smiled, proud, amused, affectionate. Then she slipped. It was a quick, terrifying moment. Her foot caught the edge of a crack in the sidewalk, her crutches jolted, and her injured leg folded awkwardly beneath her. She let out a gasp, and her body swayed forward toward the street, toward a slow-moving car that was just far enough away to make time feel cruelly suspended. But before he could react, before he could even call her name, someone else moved. A boy, no older than 8, darted forward from the sidewalk. Thin, small, wearing a faded red hoodie and sneakers that looked too big for his feet. His blonde hair was messy, and his pale face was flushed from the cold. He caught Haley by the arm with surprising steadiness and guided her back onto the sidewalk. Not roughly, not panicked, gently, like someone used to being careful. Matthew was already halfway across the street by the time he reached them. His heart was pounding. Haley looked shaken but unhurt. She clutched her crutches and blinked up at the boy beside her, who was now brushing off his jeans like nothing had happened. "Be more careful next time," the boy said to her, smiling. "Crutches are tricky." Haley nodded, still catching her breath. "Thanks." Matthew crouched beside her and checked her leg quickly, his hands moving with the calmness of practiced worry. Then he turned to the boy. "You helped her," he said quietly, still processing. "Thank you." The boy looked up at him. Blue eyes, clear, steady, and older than they should have been. He shrugged. She needed help. There was something about him that struck Matthew immediately. The clothes were clean but old, the backpack slung over his shoulder looked nearly empty, and his shoes, tied with mismatched laces, had holes near the toes. But it wasn't pity that gripped him. It was something else. Something quieter. "Where are your parents?" he asked, not harshly, just curious. The boy didn't hesitate. "They're gone. I'm by myself." Matthew froze. He didn't mean to show it, but the words hit him like a blow to the chest. The boy said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, as if he had accepted it long ago and had no need to explain further. Haley, still recovering from the scare, reached out and touched the boy's hand. "Do you want to meet my dog?" she asked innocently, as if that might fix everything. The boy smiled. "I like dogs." Matthew stood there, in the middle of the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like fog. His driver stood by the car, unsure whether to approach. The world around them kept moving, cars passed, teachers waved goodbye to students, a gust of wind blew a crumpled piece of paper across the pavement. But something had shifted. Matthew looked at the boy again, this child who had appeared out of nowhere, who had protected his daughter with a stranger's instinct and then declared, without bitterness or sadness, that he had no one. Matthew Carter had made a career out of recognizing opportunity. But what he felt in that moment wasn't a business instinct. It was the sudden, undeniable pull of something more. Something he hadn't felt in years. Something dangerously close to fate. Matthew couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond his windows, his mind cycling endlessly through the same image, that boy's face, his small hand steadying Haley, and the quiet way he'd said, "I'm by myself." The words weren't dramatic or self-pitying. They were stated as fact, with a calmness that didn't match his age. That's what disturbed Matthew most. It wasn't the tragedy of it, it was the normalization. As if being alone in the world was just something the boy had learned to carry like a coat too big for his shoulders. He got up before sunrise, restless, and made his way to the kitchen where the lights were soft and the silence sharper. He poured himself a cup of coffee but didn't drink it. Instead, he stood by the window, watching the darkness slowly peel back from the skyline. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know where he came from. But something inside him wouldn't let it go. He was a man used to solving problems with resources, people, money, access, but this wasn't a problem to fix. It was something deeper, something human. For the first time in years, he felt like a man staring at a story he didn't yet understand. Later that morning, while Haley ate breakfast and told him a long, winding story about a classmate who had tried to glue googly eyes to her crutches, Matthew casually asked if the boy from yesterday went to her school. "No," she said between bites of cereal. "I've never seen him before. I think he was just there. Maybe he was walking by." He nodded but didn't respond. He didn't want to alarm her, and he certainly didn't want to make her feel responsible. After dropping her off, he instructed his driver to circle the blocks around the school. For the better part of 2 hours, he scanned the sidewalks, parks, store entrances, anywhere a child might linger without drawing too much attention. Nothing. By the third hour, Matthew had called in a quiet favor from someone in the city's administrative offices, a friend who owed him. He asked for any recent missing child reports, unofficial shelter admissions, or unaccompanied minors flagged by police. Still nothing. The boy was invisible, or at least outside the system. That realization unsettled Matthew more than anything else. In his world, data was everything. People left traces, social security numbers, tax records, school forms. The idea that a child could live in a major city without a footprint made him feel like he was standing in a house where the walls didn't hold. Later that day, Matthew returned to the school at dismissal time. He stood near the gate, talking idly with one of the teachers about Haley's progress, his eyes constantly scanning the sidewalk, the bus stops, the alleys across the street. And then he saw him. Same hoodie, same oversized shoes, a little more dirt on his jeans. The boy was sitting on the edge of a planter across the street, eating what looked like a half-eaten granola bar. Matthew excused himself and crossed over. As he approached, the boy looked up and froze, cautious but not afraid. He didn't run. He didn't smile. He just waited. "You're here again," Matthew said, stopping a few feet away. The boy nodded, chewing slowly. "You waiting for someone?" "No." "Are you staying somewhere nearby?" "Sort of." Matthew studied him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and though he looked alert, there was a tension in his shoulders, the kind of constant readiness that came from sleeping in unsafe places. His backpack was zipped shut, but Matthew could see it sagged almost flat. No books. No lunchbox. No change of clothes. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lucas." "How old are you?" 8. "Where are you sleeping, Lucas?" Lucas hesitated. "Library sometimes. Or stairs. Depends." Matthew felt something shift in his chest. He had donated millions to children's charities, funded shelters, spoken at galas. But this was different. This wasn't charity. This was a boy who had saved his daughter from harm and then returned to vanish into a city that didn't care if he survived the night. "Would you let me get you something to eat?" Matthew asked. Lucas paused again, then nodded slowly. "Okay." They sat in a quiet diner 2 blocks away. Lucas ordered pancakes and orange juice. He ate like someone used to not knowing when his next meal would come, careful but fast, not wasting a bite. He didn't talk much. Matthew didn't push. He listened. When Lucas did speak, it was in short, precise sentences. His mother had died 6 months ago from a long illness. They'd had no family left. After she passed, a neighbor called Child Services. He ended up in a shelter, but it was crowded, loud, and cruel. He left. No one came after him. "I didn't like it there," he said, almost apologetically. "People yelled a lot." Matthew nodded. "I understand." Lucas looked at him. "Do you?" Matthew took a long breath. "Maybe not all of it. But I understand not wanting to be somewhere that doesn't feel safe." Lucas didn't respond. He just kept eating. When the check came, Matthew paid and then asked the question he'd been carrying all day. "Would you like to come stay at my house for a while? Just for tonight. You'll have your own room. A warm bed. No one yelling." Lucas blinked at him. "Why?" Matthew hesitated. "Because you helped my daughter. And because you look like someone who deserves better than this." There was a long silence. Finally, Lucas whispered, "Okay. But just for one night." Matthew smiled, not pressing further. One night. That was enough, for now. He had no idea what would come next. But as they walked out of the diner side by side, something told him the moment he'd seen Lucas steady his daughter wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Lucas didn't say much during the car ride. He sat in the back seat beside Haley, who was chatting excitedly about the pancakes he'd just eaten and telling him all the things they had at home: a huge bookshelf, a dog named Biscuit, a playroom with too many pillows, and a freezer full of the good ice cream, not the boring kind. Lucas nodded politely, responding with quiet smiles and the occasional, "cool," or "really," but he never let his body fully relax. His fingers stayed curled in his lap, his eyes drifting often to the window as if memorizing the streets in case he needed to run later. Matthew watched all of it through the rearview mirror. His instinct was to ask questions, to offer reassurance, to make the boy feel safe. But instead, he held back, sensing that Lucas didn't need words right now. He needed space. So Matthew focused on driving, letting Haley do the talking while Lucas observed the world with the quiet wariness of someone who had learned not to trust comfort too quickly. When they pulled into the driveway, Lucas's eyes widened, just slightly. The house was modern and spacious, tucked behind a tall hedge and a security gate, nothing overly flashy, but clearly far from the world he'd been surviving in. Biscuit, a scruffy golden retriever mix, came barreling toward the front door as they entered, tail wagging in a full-body blur. Haley laughed and dropped her crutches carefully so she could give him a hug. Lucas froze in the doorway, not sure if he was allowed to step inside. "You can come in," Matthew said gently. "This is your home too, for tonight." Lucas stepped inside slowly, his movements careful and precise. He looked up at the high ceilings, the clean white walls lined with photographs and framed drawings, some of which Haley proudly announced were hers. He didn't say a word, but his eyes moved constantly, absorbing everything. Matthew led him to the guest room at the end of the hall. It was usually used for visiting family or friends, but it had a twin bed, a window with thick curtains, and a small bookshelf with a few forgotten novels on the bottom shelf. Lucas walked in like he was entering a museum. He ran a finger along the edge of the desk, glanced at the clean bedsheets, and whispered, "It smells nice in here." Matthew set down a fresh towel on the dresser and said, "There are clean clothes in the closet, some extras from Haley's cousin. They might be a bit big, but they're warm." If you need anything, just knock. I'll be right down the hall. Lucas nodded but said nothing. When Matthew left the room, he waited a full 5 minutes before he moved again. He closed the door softly and sat on the edge of the bed, bouncing slightly, testing its firmness. Then he stood up, opened the closet, and stared at the clean shirts and folded jeans. He didn't touch them, not yet. He looked at the towel, the books, the lamp beside the bed, and then at the window. He walked to it, pulled back the curtain just enough to see the street, memorizing the distance between the sidewalk and the front door. It was what he always did in a new place: map the exits, check the locks, build the escape route in his head. But that night, no one shouted. No one slammed doors. No one turned off the heat or left him alone in the dark. After dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, which he ate with grateful silence, Haley showed him how to play one of her favorite board games. Lucas was hesitant at first, afraid to laugh, unsure whether this was something he was actually allowed to enjoy. But Haley was a force of nature. She teased him for being too serious, insisted he used the lucky token, and told him flat out that she didn't care if he lost, only that he played. He smiled. Just once. But it was real. That night, after Haley had gone to bed, Matthew checked in on Lucas. He expected to find the boy asleep or maybe curled up on top of the blankets. Instead, he found him sitting at the desk with the lamp on, holding one of the books from the shelf. He wasn't reading it, just looking at the pages slowly, carefully, as if the story might disappear if he turned them too quickly. "You okay?" Matthew asked softly from the doorway. Lucas nodded, not looking up. "I don't think I've ever had a room before." "Not really. Not just mine." Matthew hesitated. "You don't have to be alone in it. If you need something, anything, you just come find me. Understand?" Lucas nodded again. Matthew turned to leave but stopped when he heard the boy speak again. "I don't know how to be here." Matthew didn't answer right away. He stepped back into the room, knelt so they were eye level, and said, "You don't have to know. You're not expected to. All I care about is that you're safe, and warm, and not scared. That's it. Everything else, we'll figure out together." Lucas stared at him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly as if testing whether the words were true. Then he gave the smallest nod and whispered, "Okay." That night, he slept under the covers. Not curled in a corner, not with one eye open. Under the covers. And when Matthew peeked in before going to bed himself, he saw that the book Lucas had been holding was now tucked under his pillow. It was a small thing. But sometimes, the smallest things mean a door has quietly opened in someone's heart. And Matthew knew that however temporary this had started, this boy wasn't just a visitor anymore. Over the next few days, something shifted in the house, not drastically, not in a way that anyone could easily point out, but in a quiet, undeniable current beneath the surface. Lucas remained cautious, but he no longer flinched at every unexpected sound. He began accepting second helpings at dinner without waiting to be asked, and once, Haley caught him humming under his breath while drawing with her at the kitchen table. Matthew noticed it all. He didn't comment on it, didn't bring attention to Lucas's slow softening, but he acknowledged it in other ways, by gently including him in more routines, by making sure Lucas had his own place at the table without being told, by asking him questions that didn't pry but reminded him he mattered. The third morning, when Lucas was still asleep, Matthew stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. The boy had kicked one leg out of the blankets during the night and was curled on his side, the pillow hugged close, the same book still under his head. It hit Matthew then, not just the weight of what this child had lived through, but the staggering simplicity of what he seemed to need: stability, warmth, someone who didn't disappear. That morning, as Haley got ready for school, Matthew made a decision he hadn't allowed himself to consider fully until then. He was going to keep Lucas safe. Not just for a night, not just until the system found a place for him, but for as long as the boy wanted to stay. And if the system resisted, he'd fight it. The process began that day. Matthew met with a private attorney who specialized in family law. He explained the situation in detail, not hiding the fact that Lucas had been living on the streets, not trying to sanitize the truth. The lawyer, a calm woman named Margaret with a sharp mind and clear compassion in her eyes, listened carefully and then said what Matthew already knew. If he's not registered anywhere, no birth certificate on file, no foster record, no school enrollment, he's going to be almost invisible on paper. That can be good or bad. Good because there's no one to contest custody. Bad because it means we have to build an identity for him from the ground up. That takes time. And while we do that, someone may try to move him back into the state's custody. Matthew clenched his jaw. Then we move faster. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You're willing to fight this in court? Yes. You understand what kind of attention that may bring. You're a public figure. This could get loud. I don't care about noise, he said, his voice steady. I care about that boy. Margaret nodded. Then we'll start today. Over the next few weeks, Matthew did something he hadn't done in years. He slowed down. He rearranged his schedule, delegated more of his corporate obligations, and prioritized being home. He drove Haley to school himself, let Lucas pick out his own clothes for the day, even when the results were mismatched, and sat with both kids at the table while they did their homework. Haley adapted immediately. She never questioned the shift, never asked why Lucas was staying so long. To her, it simply made sense. He had helped her, so now they helped him. She treated him like a brother from the beginning, with the same mixture of teasing, loyalty, and fierce affection that only children seem to master so effortlessly. But not everyone was as accepting. When word began to spread that Matthew Carter had taken in a homeless boy, the speculation started. A few tabloids hinted that it was an image play, a publicity stunt. One gossip blog suggested Lucas might be an illegitimate child from a secret affair. Matthew ignored it all, but the noise grew louder when a particularly invasive journalist published photos of Lucas and Haley at a local park, framing the story as a billionaire's attempt at redemption. It wasn't just headlines. Matthew received a formal notice from the state, requesting a hearing to assess the temporary housing situation. The language was cold, legal, full of vague concern. It didn't accuse him of wrongdoing, but it questioned his long-term intentions. Lucas found the letter accidentally. It had been left on the kitchen counter, and when Matthew walked into the room, the boy was holding it, his hands trembling slightly. I can leave if it's causing trouble, he said quietly, not looking up. Matthew's voice was firm but gentle. You're not going anywhere. Lucas shook his head. They'll take me. They always do. Matthew crossed the room and knelt in front of him. No. Not this time. You're not a burden, Lucas. You're family. I don't care how long it takes or how hard it gets. I'm going to fight for you. Lucas looked at him then, really looked at him. There was disbelief in his eyes, but also something softer, hope trying to find a place to land. He didn't say anything, just nodded and held on to the letter like it was proof of something, even if he wasn't sure yet what it meant. That night, as Matthew lay in bed, he felt the weight of what he was doing settle fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't a business deal. There were no guaranteed outcomes, no projected returns. This was about a child, one who had trusted him not to vanish like everyone else had. And Matthew, for the first time in his life, wasn't interested in controlling the future. He just wanted to earn it. The night before the custody hearing, a storm swept through the city. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled low across the skyline like the growl of something ancient and unsettled. Inside the Carter home, the atmosphere was calmer but undeniably tense. Lucas had been quieter than usual all day. He'd sat through dinner without saying much, picked at his food, and later declined Haley's offer to play cards, saying he was tired. He had gone to bed early, or at least pretended to. Matthew noticed. He always noticed now. He stood outside Lucas's bedroom door for a moment, debating whether to knock, then decided to let the boy have his silence. Not everything needed to be solved with words. But later that night, just before midnight, he heard a soft sound, a barely audible rustle, followed by the creak of the hallway floorboards. When he stepped out, Lucas was standing by the front door in his socks, holding his backpack tightly to his chest. Matthew didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He simply walked over and sat down on the bottom stair near the door, waiting. Lucas froze when he saw him but didn't run. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears, his jaw clenched like he was holding everything together with sheer force. "I wasn't going to steal anything," Lucas said quickly, before Matthew could speak. "I was just going to leave. I can't mess this up for you." Matthew remained seated, his expression calm. "Why would you think you're messing anything up?" Lucas looked down at his feet. "Because you're in trouble now. People are writing things, and tomorrow, they might take me away. If I leave first, maybe they won't bother you anymore." Matthew's heart cracked open in a way he hadn't thought possible. He rose slowly and walked over to Lucas, kneeling so they were at eye level. "Lucas," he said gently, "you are not trouble. You're not a problem to fix. You're not something I'm tolerating. You are part of this family. I don't want you to go. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever." Lucas wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie, but the tears kept coming now, fast and hot. "They always say stuff like that. Then they leave. Or I have to." "I won't," Matthew said, without hesitation. "And if you ever feel scared again, I want you to come to me. Not the door. Me." There was a long silence between them, thick with emotion. Then Lucas stepped forward and leaned into him, awkwardly at first, like someone learning a language they were never taught. Matthew wrapped his arms around him and held him tightly, feeling how small and light he still was, how much of his body was made of fear he had no business carrying at such a young age. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered. They arrived at the courthouse early, accompanied by Margaret, the attorney, and a court-appointed child psychologist who had interviewed Lucas in the weeks prior. Haley stayed home with a trusted nanny, unaware of the full stakes of the day but confident, as only a child could be, that her brother would come back home no matter what. Lucas sat beside Matthew in the waiting room, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. The boy had worn one of his new collared shirts and combed his hair carefully, but he still looked like someone waiting to be punished for something he didn't do. When they were called into the courtroom, the space felt larger than it needed to be, the walls sterile and indifferent. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes but a tired kindness beneath her formality. She asked the usual questions, about Matthew's employment, living situation, relationship with Lucas, intentions regarding long-term guardianship. Matthew answered calmly, clearly, without theatrics. Then the judge turned to Lucas. "Do you feel safe with Mr. Carter?" she asked. Lucas hesitated only a second before nodding. "Do you want to continue living with him?" Lucas looked at Matthew, then back at the judge. His voice came out small, but certain. "Yes. He doesn't pretend to care. He really does. And he doesn't leave." There was a pause in the room. Even Margaret looked down briefly, affected by the raw honesty in that quiet answer. The psychologist gave her professional evaluation, recommending in strong terms that Lucas remain in Matthew's care. "This is not a temporary arrangement born of pity," she said firmly. "This is a stable, nurturing home. The child has made visible emotional progress under Mr. Carter's guardianship, and the bond between them is authentic and mutually beneficial." The judge took a few minutes to review the documents. Then she looked up, hands folded in front of her. "In the absence of any viable biological guardianship and in consideration of the child's well-being, I am approving the petition for full legal custody. Lucas Carter will be officially recognized as the legal son of Matthew Carter, effective immediately." Matthew exhaled slowly, relief flooding him. He turned to Lucas, who blinked like he hadn't quite understood what had just happened. "It's official," Matthew said, voice low and smiling. "You're home." Lucas didn't smile at first. He looked down, then back up, and suddenly threw his arms around Matthew's neck, holding him tightly with a strength that came from every moment he'd ever been afraid to hope. That night, there were no reporters at the gate. No headlines in the papers. No loud declarations. Just a boy with a new last name, a man who had chosen to stay, and a family that had been formed not by blood, but by a decision to love without conditions. The weeks that followed the court's decision unfolded in quiet, steady rhythm. There was no sudden transformation, no grand emotional climax, just the gradual unfolding of a new normal, one built on stability, choice, and trust. Lucas no longer waited for permission to enter a room. He no longer flinched when someone raised their voice in another room or double-checked the exits before going to sleep. He began sleeping with his door closed, not because he was afraid of being seen, but because he finally believed no one would leave while he wasn't looking. Haley adapted seamlessly, as if nothing monumental had changed except the name she now used when introducing Lucas. "This is my brother," she'd say proudly to anyone who asked. Not, "foster brother," or "friend," or "just staying with us." Brother. Lucas, for his part, took some time to accept the word, not because he didn't want it, but because he had never been called anything that permanent before. School brought its own challenges. Lucas had been out of the system for almost a year, and even before that, his attendance had been spotty. He struggled with basic math and reading comprehension, though it was clear he was intelligent, just behind. Matthew hired a tutor, a patient woman named Evelyn, who came 3 times a week and treated Lucas not as a problem to be fixed but as a mind waiting to be reawakened. She never made him feel small for not knowing something. Instead, she celebrated the moment he figured it out. Lucas began looking forward to her visits more than anyone expected. One evening, while helping him with fractions at the dining table, Evelyn said gently, "You're not bad at this, you just never had someone sit with you long enough." Lucas didn't reply, but something shifted in his posture. He sat up straighter, leaned in, and tried again. Matthew continued to reshape his own life around this new reality. Meetings were now carefully scheduled to avoid missing bedtime stories. Boardrooms were exited early when school projects needed help. His staff adapted quickly, seeing the subtle but undeniable change in their boss. He hadn't become softer, but he had become more human. The man who used to measure time in billable hours now measured it in chapters read, dinners shared, and moments missed if he wasn't paying attention. The media storm eventually faded. Another scandal took its place in the news cycle, and the public's attention drifted, as it always does. The whispers about Matthew adopting a homeless boy turned into a footnote in online articles. But inside the Carter household, something far more important was taking root, a family, shaped not by resemblance or shared bloodlines, but by consistent presence and growing affection. One afternoon, Matthew returned from a meeting early to find the house quiet. Haley was at a play date. The tutor had just left. He walked past Lucas's room and noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, Lucas was sitting on the floor, surrounded by pages of pencil drawings, comic book panels, each one more detailed than the last. Matthew had seen him doodle before but never like this. The drawings told a story, a young boy in a cape who didn't fly, but walked city streets, helping people, always alone until one panel showed him being offered a hand. Matthew knocked gently on the doorframe. Lucas looked up, startled at first, then relaxed. "Those are good," Matthew said. "You draw better than I ever could." Lucas shrugged, embarrassed. "Just something I do when it's quiet." "Can I ask what this story's about?" Lucas hesitated, then gave a small smile. "It's about a kid who doesn't have a superpower. Just good eyes. He sees things other people miss." Matthew nodded. "Sounds like a hero to me." Lucas looked down at his drawing. He doesn't feel like one. Sometimes heroes don't, Matthew said. They just do the right thing anyway. Later that evening, Haley returned home and dragged Matthew into the living room to watch her rehearse a short scene for a school play. Lucas joined them on the couch, curling his knees to his chest, watching with a relaxed ease that was new. When the scene ended, Haley bowed dramatically, and Matthew clapped as if she were on Broadway. Lucas clapped too, smiling at her with genuine pride. Afterward, they had dinner, spaghetti, which ended in a minor noodle-throwing war between the kids. Matthew laughed, even as he wiped tomato sauce off his shirt. He hadn't remembered laughter feeling like this in a long time, easy, real, earned. That night, while tucking Lucas into bed, Matthew paused at the doorway. "Hey," he said, "about those drawings, if you ever want to do something more with them, like enter a contest or make a book, I'll help you. I mean it." Lucas's voice was quiet but firm. "Thanks. I might want to. Later." Matthew nodded. "Take your time." Lucas hesitated, then said, "I used to think families were just people you're stuck with. But this is different." Matthew stepped back in and sat on the edge of the bed. "How is it different?" Lucas looked at him, his voice barely above a whisper. "You chose me. You didn't have to. But you did." Matthew swallowed the lump in his throat and leaned forward, placing a hand gently over the blanket. "I'll choose you every day, Lucas. That's what family means." For the first time, Lucas reached out and held Matthew's hand in return. That night, the house felt warmer, even though the weather outside had turned cold. And somewhere down the hallway, in a quiet room that used to belong to no one, a boy who had spent far too long alone finally fell asleep without fear. It was early spring when the letter arrived. The trees outside the Carter home were just beginning to show hints of green, and the air had that soft warmth that made windows stay open a little longer and footsteps linger on porches. Haley had just returned from school and was bouncing through the hallway, already talking about a class field trip. Lucas trailed behind her, quieter but relaxed, his backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks slightly flushed from the walk. Matthew was in the kitchen, sorting through the mail, half listening to their chatter when he came across the envelope. It was thin, plain, handwritten with no return address. The name on the front was simple, Lucas Carter. Matthew felt his chest tighten slightly. It was rare for Lucas to receive mail, and even rarer for it to come with no sender listed. He set it aside on the counter, unsure whether to give it to Lucas immediately or check its contents first. But something inside him, some growing trust, perhaps, told him to let the boy decide. Later that evening, after dinner and a short movie, Lucas noticed the envelope on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands like it was something delicate. Matthew watched from a respectful distance, waiting. "Can I open it?" Lucas asked quietly. "It's addressed to you," Matthew replied. "You don't need permission." Lucas sat down at the table, carefully tearing the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. As he unfolded it, Matthew could see the subtle change in the boy's face, not alarm, not fear, but something more complex, recognition. Lucas read in silence for a long moment, then read it again. When he looked up, his eyes were glassy, but his mouth was curved in the faintest smile. "It's from someone who knew my mom," he said finally. His voice was calm but filled with something Matthew hadn't heard in it before, peace. "A woman she worked with at a diner a long time ago. She didn't know I was still alive until she saw a news article. She said my mom used to talk about me all the time." Matthew stepped closer, gently. "What did she say?" Lucas looked back down at the letter and read aloud, "She used to tell me, my son is special. One day someone will believe in him, and he'll do great things. He just needs someone to see him." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Matthew sat down across from him, watching as Lucas held the letter to his chest. It wasn't a long message, not dramatic or poetic, but it hit like thunder. The boy who had spent so long thinking he had been forgotten had just been reminded that someone, somewhere, had remembered him. And more importantly, that his mother had believed in him until the end. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Lucas asked quietly. Matthew didn't hesitate. "I think she'd be in awe of you." Lucas nodded slowly, folding the letter with care and slipping it into his notebook, between two blank pages he used for his drawings. Then he got up and walked over to Matthew, who stood as well, unsure if Lucas was about to leave the room or ask something else. Instead, the boy hugged him. It wasn't the careful, tentative hug of the past, or the spontaneous squeeze of gratitude from a child unsure of affection. It was a deliberate, full-hearted embrace, arms wrapped tightly around Matthew's middle, face pressed into his chest, breathing deep and steady. Matthew wrapped his arms around him in return, holding him just as tightly, aware of the significance of this simple act. Haley entered the kitchen a moment later and tilted her head at the sight of them. "Did I miss something?" she asked playfully. Lucas pulled back, wiping his face but smiling. "Just a letter." Haley, never one to be left out, walked over and hugged them both without asking for an explanation. And for a minute, they stood there, an unlikely family formed not by chance, but by choice, by the difficult, beautiful effort of staying when leaving would have been easier. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Matthew sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea and thought about the letter. He thought about Lucas's mother, about how she must have clung to hope even as everything around her collapsed. He thought about the thousands of small decisions that had led them all here, to this house, this peace, this family. It hadn't been easy. None of it was. But he realized, in that still moment, that the best things in life rarely are. He got up, walked to Lucas's room, and peeked in. The boy was asleep, the letter still tucked into the notebook on his desk. Beside it, a new drawing, one Matthew hadn't seen before, lay half-finished. It was a picture of three people standing in front of a small house with a big tree. A man, a girl, and a boy. Above them, written in large, uneven letters, were the words, "We belong here." And for the first time in a long time, Matthew didn't feel like a man who had lost something. He felt like a man who had found exactly what he didn't know he was missing. By the time summer arrived, the Carter household had settled into something that felt less like a routine and more like a life. It was no longer remarkable that Lucas had his own toothbrush, his own drawer of socks, his own place at the table. It was no longer strange that his name was written on the side of his backpack, or that Haley introduced him without hesitation as her brother. These things had become normal, even mundane, and yet they carried a quiet power, the kind of power that comes from repetition, from security, from the daily choice to stay. Lucas had started calling Matthew Dad. There was no ceremony, no build-up. It happened one morning over cereal. He asked, "Dad, can we go to the park after lunch?" And Matthew's spoon froze midair before he looked up and simply answered, "Of course." That was it. No one spoke about it afterward, and no one needed to. The word fit. It felt earned, not given, and Lucas never took it for granted. One particular morning, Lucas was up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, sunlight filtering in through the kitchen windows, catching flecks of dust in the air. He sat at the counter with a piece of toast in one hand, the other busy flipping through a sketchbook full of characters he'd been creating for weeks. There were pages and pages of rough comic panels, a boy with a flashlight that never ran out of batteries, a girl who could fly but only when she was laughing, a dog that barked riddles. His imagination had opened like a window during a storm, and he was finally learning not to shut it again. Matthew entered the kitchen with a stack of mail and a cup of coffee, pausing when he saw Lucas already awake. "Early start?" he asked, leaning on the counter. Lucas shrugged with a small smile. "Couldn't sleep. Had an idea." Matthew nodded and glanced down at the sketchbook. "You ever think about showing these to someone? A publisher? A magazine?" Lucas hesitated. "They're just for fun." "They're more than that," Matthew said. You have something here. Something real. Lucas looked down at the drawings again, this time with something more like belief in his eyes. He didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss it either. That afternoon, the three of them attended a local youth storytelling event at the community center. Haley had signed up to read one of her poems, and Lucas had quietly submitted a short comic script under a fake name, too nervous to claim it openly. The hall was filled with families, some big, some small, some loud, some cautious. It felt safe. Warm. The kind of space Lucas used to avoid but now found himself relaxing into, even enjoying. When Haley went up to the microphone, her voice shook at first, but then she found her rhythm. She read about stars and shadows and how sometimes, love sounds like footsteps that never leave. The room was silent, listening, and when she finished, the applause was genuine. Lucas clapped the loudest. A few speakers later, the coordinator read Lucas's comic aloud. The crowd laughed in all the right places and leaned forward during the quiet moments. When it ended, the room applauded again, and Lucas, though not named, looked around as if trying to hold the moment in his hands. Matthew leaned down and whispered, "Proud of you." Lucas didn't say anything, but his smile stretched wider than it had in days. As summer deepened, the family took a small vacation, a road trip upstate, just the three of them. They stayed in a cabin near a lake, roasted marshmallows, told ghost stories, and let their phones go dark for a few days. One night, sitting beneath a sky scattered with stars, Lucas asked Matthew, "Did you ever think this would happen?" Matthew, watching the fire crackle, replied, "Not once. But I'm glad it did." "Me too," Lucas said. I think Mom would be okay with this." Matthew looked at him, saw the honesty in his face, the vulnerability that had once been buried under fear and doubt. "I think she'd be more than okay," he said. "I think she'd be proud." Lucas didn't cry, but his eyes shimmered in the firelight, and he didn't look away. The final morning of the trip, Lucas woke up early and wandered down to the lake alone. The water was still, the mist rising like breath from the surface. He sat on a log near the shore, knees pulled to his chest, and let himself be quiet. Not because he was afraid, or sad, or planning his next move, but because he didn't need to run anymore. He belonged here, in this moment, in this life. Back at the cabin, Matthew and Haley were packing up, and when Lucas returned, he helped without being asked. They worked in easy silence, the way real families often do, not filling space with talk, but sharing it without hesitation. When they arrived back home later that day, Lucas walked through the front door and paused. The house smelled like them now. Like dinners cooked together, like laundry folded and left on the stairs, like the vanilla candle Haley insisted on lighting after school. He dropped his bag and stood still for a moment, letting the weight of home settle on his shoulders not as a burden, but as comfort. Matthew walked past him, ruffled his hair, and said, "Welcome back." Lucas looked up and answered, "It's good to be home." And it was. In every sense of the word.